hard
It's very hard copy.
Very hard copy. Like so much so that like we have this like brief review every year. We send it hard copy to legislators still. Like, we
That's
do
like
it.
judges.
And because they won't read it if you don't. That's the worst. And we make sure we make it formalized, we put it on their desk. And we get we get emails back being like, I read your publication. You sent me an email. I'm like, okay. I guess we'll keep doing this very annoying thing.
You might have bumped into them in Springfield, but my partner works for Advanced Illinois, which is like an education.
Anyone else need to sign
Like it does like education looking basically. And she's always like they need like she does every year these like printouts for new members about like basically how school funding works in Illinois because it's very complicated.
Yeah.
And if you don't, she's like,
I think that's selling your soul
email
to
it,
the
and then
devil.
she's like, if you don't hand it to them,
It's not real.
it doesn't exist to them.
Yeah.
Do you do a lot of work in Springfield?
I used to. I don't anymore. Now we work all over the place. But when I was working at Chicago Appleseed, I was there all the time. So.
Oh no! Here, you know what? I'm gonna be standing because I have to control the computer. So do you want to take my folding chair? Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. Here, would you like to? We can put you right here. We can also put you up in the back. Whatever.
No, I want
okay.
it right here.
Yeah, sounds good. There you go, sir. All right. So thank you everyone for coming. If you haven't yet, there is a sign-in sheet that I know is being sort of twirled about. That way, if there's any follow-up questions or if folks want a copy of the presentation we're doing or sort of any other materials, we can sort of shoot that out to the group that's most interested. But with that being said, welcome to Information is Power, Investigating State Parole Systems. My name is Matthew, and I'm with the MacArthur Justice Center. The sort of main driver behind this workshop is that like parole systems, they kind of operate, they operate very much so in the shadows and in the dark. It's very hard to sort of get to know more information about them, even at the most basic level. Some have crazy exemptions from public records laws or open meetings acts. And because of the difficulties in getting information about parole, we wanted to have an opportunity for us to work together to sort of talk about some practices that we have learned when it comes to figuring out what the problem is with parole and getting hard data about those problems, getting hard facts and policies about those problems. So with that, would my co-panelists like to introduce themselves?
Sure. I'm Sarah Stout. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Prison Policy Initiative. PPI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan national organization that mostly works at the state level, just in many, many states, that seeks to expose the harms of mass incarceration and find policy solutions to them. And one of the things that we work on a lot is parole. Prior to this, I also was an Illinois-based advocate and know quite a bit about the Illinois parole system. But yeah, I'll let Emmett talk a little bit about the recent work PPI's done on parole.
Sure. Hi everyone, Emmett Sanders, he, him pronouns. I'm Policy and Advocacy Associate with Prison Policy Initiative. I'm also formerly incarcerated myself. I spent 22 years in prison right here in the amazing state of Illinois. So a little bit familiar with it. And yeah, we've been looking into parole, particularly recently, just in terms of parole grant rates. It's been been a major focus of what we've been doing. So we have a couple of pieces that came out. One, the release, where we looked at grant rates from 2019 to 2022 to sort of see how to sort of track them to show that they've actually been declining like all across the country in the 34 states where discretionary parole is a main mechanism of release. And we also, we got done with that and we saw folks from California reach out because they have a pretty large discretionary parole system, even though they've actually got rid of discretionary parole at one point, and asked us to sort of follow up. And so we did a going back to Cali piece where we actually looked at the program rates there. And fun fact, the program rates, if you look at them in California, are almost the same as those in South Carolina, which is pretty much the lowest in the country. So yeah, that's kind of where we're.
So we're going to start by just talking about what data is actually available about parole and where can we find it. There's lots of different kinds of data. You know, I think we think about data as numbers, but we're going to talk about lots of different kinds of ways that we can get information about parole systems. We are going to start with statistical data. The numbers question. I'll mostly pass this over to Emmett, but if you go to the next slide, I'll start talking a little bit. So what categories of statistical parole data exist? There's two, I put things in like two main buckets to like think about them. The first is about who's on parole, so who in the community is on parole. Often you can get, and that comes, and with both of these things, it comes in two forms. There's aggregate information, which is often the easier information to find. So for who's on parole, it might be demographic and charge information. Sometimes revocation information will be published in the aggregate. And then there's what I think of as the gold standard in terms of being able to actually investigate parole systems, which is population data sets with individual information. Now, I have serious problems with privacy implications of the fact that this data is publicly available, but the fact is that most of the time it is. And from our perspective, it means that as long as we are good stewards of private information, we're able to actually look at this data in ways that are different than how the parole system has aggregated its own data. Because they make up their own, they decide what's important and they publish it in their reports. So better thing is to look at population data sets with individual information. I'll just finish up this slide and then pass it to you. The other category of information is information about parole decisions. Similarly comes in two groups. You've got your annual report type data, which there are a lot of states that post that online, but similarly, data sets with individual decision outcomes, and Emmett can tell you, this data can be, basically handwritten. Like truly at the lowest level of automation, but there is often data sets with individual decision outcomes that can give you a lot more to work with in terms of figuring out what's actually going on with parole.
So just a note about what Sarah just said about them being handwritten, that was actually a response we got from Mississippi, that the only information they could offer us was handwritten on the back of hearing schedules. So yeah, again, like the data collection, even from that standpoint, can be difficult, right? So how can we get statistical data? Well, there are four general ways that we can actually do that. We can look at publicly posted data. A lot of states, they actually make annual reports, biannual reports. Like you can actually find this data online if you know where to look. And so it's a matter of actually going into the websites for the DOCs and the parole boards and really like navigating that and learning how to sort of pull that out and looking for key terms. Data gathered by other researchers, so we've put stuff together, Rabina has put stuff together, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but there are folks who have actually been collecting this stuff and putting it together, and so, pulling our resources and pulling our information and, drawing from that is really important. And formally requested data. This is essentially getting in touch with the people who are running parole, calling the parole authorities, and just seeing what they'll offer you. Seeing what you can just pull from them without actual formal request. But then there are the records requests, the formal requests, right? And these vary from state to state. In California, you have the PRAs, and you have the FOIAs. It's different in different places. But these are formal ways to actually request data, and I'm sure some of you may be familiar with it. We'll walk through that a little bit later. So where to find publicly posted data? Yeah, checking the Department of Corrections and the parole board websites. Like I said, a lot of what you're doing is figuring out the terminology, figuring out what they're using, where they're hiding this stuff, right? So it may be the parole board may or may not fall under the scope of the DOC. It may be a separate entity entirely. It may be, you can find the reports underneath the DOCs as well. And so it really is like going in there and just trying to navigate that kind of stuff. You're looking for headings titled research reports, annual reports, any kind of publications, these kinds of things like that. Look for tabs that say something like that. And you'll be a lot of times you'll be able to find the annual reports or any kind of statistical data like that.
I'll also add one more thing that I didn't put on this slide. Google is your friend here because sometimes they will take the actual document off the link of their website, but leave it on the web. So if you have something that you're looking for, like, for example, I've had groups that have only posted the most recent annual report. If you look at the URL for that annual report and you see a 2023, try changing it to a 2021. You would be surprised how often it pops up. Or simply Googling annual report state 2024 parole. And you will often find things that they didn't necessarily intend for you to find, which is great.
Yeah, and when you search the websites, actually, you can go, a lot of times you can go into the search bar and literally just put in like parole report, parole grants or something like that, and you'll be able to, it'll pull it up even when it's not like pinned somewhere else. Yeah, so quantitative,
Do you want me to do this?
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so there is a lot of quantitative data that has been gathered by other researchers. This is mostly aggregate data, but it can be really helpful. These are links, and we will send out these this slide so you can have links to these. But these are the 4 big things that we've learned from. First is the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is a clearinghouse, a federal clearinghouse for data about all sorts of things about the criminal legal system. They have a range of data points gathered from all 50 states about probation and parole. Their most recent report is in 2022. I'll plug our own stuff. We've done 3 big research projects that you can look at that have data in appendix tables that you can pull and look for your state. One on discretionary parole rates, one on total parole populations. And then we also have something called our research library, which is just a bevy of links to stuff all over the web about parole, which is linked there. Probably the most comprehensive set of information about parole systems in states that still maintain discretionary parole systems for all or most people in custody. There's 33 states. Is the Robina Institute at the University of Minnesota made a comprehensive guide to the legal framework of every state that has widespread discretionary parole. So it's 33 states. It's frustrating because, of course, Illinois, for example, has a parole system. Robina didn't count it because they technically abolished parole, so even though, it's only for 33 states. But if you're in one of those 33 states, incredibly useful. They include some limited statistical data. More importantly, they really do include about everything you would ever want to know about what the actual laws are that govern parole. You're going to want to do a quick check to make sure they're still updated because it's between 2016 and 2018. But if there's been a change in your state's laws since 2018 on parole, you hopefully already know about it. And then Council of State Governments has a confined and costly report where they've got state-by-state revocation and reincarceration rates. So before you go down that rabbit hole, that's a worthwhile one to check.
Yeah, okay, so just some tips for informally requesting data. Use your people skills, right? So it's very much just like how you talk to folks a lot of times. A lot of times when you put in a formal records request, there will be pushback. Like people will lock down, they will shut stuff down if they can. And sometimes informally requesting it, you're sort of circumventing that whole defensive process where the people are shutting down. Be polite, constructive, make sure you're only asking for what you need. Like, again, like these are just basic common sense things that you're talking about, right? Like when you're reaching out to these organizations and you're talking to like parole authorities, parole representatives from the parole board. I spoke to someone in Montana who was very helpful in directing me towards where the information was on the Montana Department of Corrections website where I can actually find it. Just really, working with those people skills. And make sure that if you look for things that you know that they have somewhere, like if you can find that there are requirements for them to keep this sort of data or keep these sort of records, then you know that they exist somewhere. You can sort of use that as a leverage.
I have one more funny tip. If you are a lawyer, do not say you are a lawyer. And if possible, have someone call who isn't a lawyer so that if they Google your name, they don't find out that they're being talked to a lawyer because they will transfer you to legal so fast that you'll never get anything. I swear.
I have deleted the word paralegal out of my
like straight up.
signature. Don't do it.
All right. So the second big kind of data, and we don't think of this as data sometimes, but it is data, is policies and procedures. So every parole board operates by some set of policies and procedures. Do they follow those policies and procedures? Possibly not. Are those policies and procedures written down? Possibly not. But there's something in every state. Here's some of the things you might be interested in if you're sort of wondering where to start. Board composition and selection, decision-making criteria, risk assessments and other evaluation methods for people up for parole. There's a remarkable number of states that actually have laws that do require that information be kept somewhere so you can actually find it. Existence and functioning of medical or compassionate release systems, supervision practices, revocation practices. A lot of times there are going to be written records of this. I'll give this to Adam for a sec.
So just a note, on the last thing when we were talking about board composition, so Ravina actually does a lot about board composition. And I know there was a question earlier in the main session there where folks were asking about like, we were talking about like what the composition actually looks like. And so a lot of places, law enforcement is actually required to be on there, right? But there are some places where they're also required to have like a social worker or someone who has some kind of experience in another way. Those are very much more rare than those requiring like law enforcement or corrections experience. But that information does exist. So just a quick note about terminology and definition. So one of the hard parts, honestly, is when you're looking at parole systems, there is no universal language. They use very, very different language to describe very similar processes, or very similar language to describe disparate processes, right? And so like kind of navigating that. So when you hear continuance, for example, right, they could mean one thing in one place and something completely different somewhere else. And there's several different kinds of continuances. So navigating that terminology, and like really trying to figure out what that actually means is really important. And you'll find that a lot, like on these websites. If you go into there and dig through the data, a lot of times you'll find like the description of it, or you can request the terminology. You can request that be included with like your public records request or these kinds of things. One of the things I did want to stress here, this idea of non-decision. So we heard earlier where they were talking about deferrals, right? And so you go before a parole board, you can be granted release, you can be denied release, but you can also have this other whole range of options happen, right? That do not result in release. And so when we were looking at it, what we try to do is look at like actual grant rate, because what they'll do is they'll remove that pool of people from the population that they're looking at, and then boost their grant rates. It actually makes their grant rates higher because they're reducing the total pool that they're drawing from, right? And so if you look at California, you had, I think it was like 49% of people who were eligible for parole didn't actually receive hearings. That never happened. So there were 49% of those were non-decisions. And then they were able to, by removing that, and they even make reference of it within their own documents and stuff, by removing that, they changed their grant rate. For their actual grant rate was about 14%, they changed it to about 33%, right? So artificially elevating in that way. But looking for things like non-decisions, things like continuances, things like deferrals, these kinds of things are kind of important to understand what it is. Another thing that's really important is to see what happens when their hearing does not result in parole. How long before they get another hearing, right? Because in California, it can be up to 15 years before they get another hearing. In some places, it's a year, in some places, it's 3 years. So if you're looking at grant rates in particular, really trying to understand like what it means when someone actually does not get granted parole.
And there's also often, of course, like there are within these policies and procedures, we had some pretty good luck with actually finding that they had glossaries in there somewhere deep buried that talked about what they call everything. And man, it's really true that every state called everything something different. Next slide. So talk about just one basic distinction that I think is helpful to think about: statutes versus policies. So every state has a statute that governs parole decision making. Again, how detailed is that statute? It varies, but there is one in every state. The Robina Institute's great for that. Even though their data is a little old, they will always have the citation, and you can go look up the law and make sure that it's the same as what they're talking about. But many parole boards have these policies that go into a lot more detail than statutes do. Some states you can get lucky because they're actually required to be contained in administrative codes, which means you can definitely get access to them because it's like a kind of law, right? An administrative code. Others are on parole board websites. They'll be informal handbooks, or you have to go by records requests. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matthew to talk about our next kind of data.
Yeah, so there's obviously parole boards themselves and supervising agencies have a lot of data internally that they keep, but obviously people who are involved in the system, whether as someone who's incarcerated or their family, a friend, also have a lot of information from firsthand experience. So the first big way you can sort of learn about people's firsthand experience is through interviews. This can be if someone's still incarcerated and was, say, denied parole many times. You can set up a legal phone call, go visit. If someone's on parole, it can be a little trickier to find them because you don't know where they are necessarily. But if you have, say, contacts in the community who know someone on parole, interviews are a great way to learn in depth about very specific topics. So if you're trying to figure out, a new law passed in a state, and we're trying to see if it's being fully implemented by the Department of Corrections and Parole Board. The Department of Corrections and Parole Board may give you a policy that says, hey, here's everything that we're doing to implement this. But you can talk to someone who's been through the parole process and say, did they give you X, right? They're supposed to give you X. Did they give you X? Did they give you Y? I also think that related to that, it can be a great way to sort of undercut the official narrative that's coming out about things, because you can basically say, let's say, especially if you're from a law firm, you are talking with, opposing counsel or the Department of Corrections, and they're saying, no, this is what's happening, right? Like we are doing X, we promise. But you can then say, I've spoken to like 5 people who have not heard a peep about what you're talking about. And so I think that interviews can be a really great way to sort of learn how an official policy is trickling through, from the DOC central office, from the parole board central office, through the vast bureaucracy into the classification officers, the corrections officers, the parole officers, and then information may eventually get to our clients. I am talking, I am with a law firm, and so we have the ability to set up confidential phone calls with people that are sort of part of an investigation we're doing. We have the ability to set up phone calls with clients that are confidential. We have the ability to set up confidential phone calls with people who we are considering representing or who are seeking legal advice. If you are not from a law firm and you're, say, talking with someone on the phone at a prison, if you are talking with someone through the mail, you're being recorded and your letters are being probably like scanned and kept in some database. I know for a fact they even do that for some legal mail, which they're not supposed to, but I've literally gotten calls from people at prisons where we sort of sent like mass know your rights mailings. Like, hey, I read this letter you sent in, do you mind if I pass it around to some other people that it might be able to help? And I'm like, that's somewhat helpful, but also you really shouldn't be opening and reading legal mail. Those are the craziest phone calls that I received. Some weird phone calls. But finding people, number one, I think FOIA requests, if you can get individualized data, like let's say you're trying to talk with someone who's parole eligible, if you can get data that says here's all the people in the state that are parole eligible, attending court or parole hearings, so especially if you're looking for someone who's been their parole revoked, if you sit at your parole board all day and you just sort of watch people go up for parole or go up for a parole violation hearing, if you take that person's information down, you can then follow up with them after the fact. And then in terms of best practices, I'm no expert in sort of being I'm no psychologist when it comes to sort of trauma-informed interviewing. I'm no expert. I can send around information. I will just say 2 quick things about this. The first is that in the parole context, I found it can be really easy to accidentally use language that makes it sound like the person you're talking to is at fault, right? Like you can be like, oh, you didn't take this class like you were supposed to, right? Like it can be very easy to sort of say that because it's in the moment, it's quick. You usually only have like 20 to 30 minutes on a legal call. So I would just be very clear when you're interviewing someone in the parole context that like, you probably just didn't have the chance to take the class, right? Like you probably, like there are a million different disciplinaries out there that people get for all sorts of ticky-tack things and things they didn't do, and there's no way to contest it. And then the other thing is that especially if you are, whether you're representing a law firm or not, being very clear about like the limits of confidentiality. And so if you're calling on a law firm, someone may have a pending criminal case and want to talk about that with you. But you should be really careful about what information you delve into, because your sort of like the limits of confidentiality don't always extend to every little thing that happens. Surveys are basically a way of just doing interviews at scale, right? Like you take a survey, you throw some questions on there, you can do a mass mailing, and you get back a ton of descriptive information and qualitative information, quantitative and qualitative information, right? So you can ask everybody, hey, do you have a parole release plan given to you on time? And then boom, as people send it back, you're building, in essence, a quantitative data set of the numbers of people in a given place that have a parole release plan on time. You're also collecting qualitative data, right? Like you can ask, were you given a notice of rights before your revocation process or a notice of allegations? What did they tell you about getting an attorney for your parole revocation hearing? And that's why I love surveys, because you can basically get all this information at once. And you can even pair it with follow-up interviews for people who maybe have more to say, or people who, some people even write in the survey, like, I'd love to talk with you about this process, I think it went wrong. And so these two things can work in tandem. The cons are basically that they're more expensive for you, because you need, postage, labor, sort of like the time to review them and then do any reply mailing. And they're more expensive for the incarcerated person, because they have to find an envelope, a stamp. If you're not writing sort of in regards to a very specific legal case, they usually can't get free stamps or envelopes, even if it is sort of like legal mail through the system. They are less secure in the sense that anytime you sort of put something on paper, it's there, right? Like anyone in the room knows that like once it's written on paper, it can be very difficult to not be on paper. So it's a little less secure than say doing a phone call that isn't being monitored. This is an example of a survey that we sent out in a given state. As you can see here, we're trying to figure out who has what's called a case plan and who has what's called a discharge plan. These are sort of different types of plans that you're supposed to be getting in a given state about parole. And so we were able to take this information and build a data set about the numbers of people that have been given these plans and the number of people that haven't, along with some other information about their parole experience. So that sort of can be one, and we have like hundreds of these back at the office, and so it can really help you build a data set. One of the other big types of information you can get is correspondence among board members or DOC employees and other employees. Emails sent by public officials are public information, generally. There are some exceptions, including information sent to lawyers. There are, in a lot of states, exemptions for records regarding parole and like deliberations of parole. If, for instance, your state, and we'll talk about Freedom of Information Act requests later, but if your state makes parole files exempt from public records requests, you may not be able to get emails discussing parole decisions either. But the information you can get can be really powerful, right? It can help you create a timeline. Generally, folks' like Outlook calendars and email calendars are public information. You can use it to substantiate who knew what and when. And I have an example on the next slide that will show that more. And you can also get standard operating procedures at an even more granular level than say policies and procedures manuals, because you can see what happens when, say, in Illinois, they have to appoint an attorney for your MSR revocation hearing. You can see very granularly, okay, this person A, sends an email to attorney B requesting that they come to hearing C. So the emails can really help sort of shine a light on that process. And you can see here an email that we got in Illinois in regards to someone's revocation hearing. The goal of sort of this was to try to understand how early attorneys are notified that they have a parole revocation pending, and to better understand how early the Prisoner Review Board in Illinois knows that there is a parole revocation that's going to be happening soon. And so we got a whole bunch of emails basically from bureaucrats at the Prisoner Review Board, emailing attorneys like this, being like, hey, can you like be on WebEx next week for a hearing? So that really, and then we have another one here. This is a memo. It's not an email. I believe it was an attachment to an email, but still you can get, it doesn't just have to be emails. It can be letters, memos, interagency notices, stuff like that. All of that in your state should really be presumptively open. And we will talk a little bit about what happens in a few seconds if your state decides to say, well, no, these are not public records. And with that, we are going to move on to our next big chunk, which is formal public records requests. I know we've talked a lot about public records requests as a really powerful tool for getting data that is not already public information. In Illinois, as well as the federal government in many states, it's referred to as the Freedom of Information Act. Your state will have its own, and it will have its own name. In some states, it's the Public Records Act, the Freedom of Information Law, a Sunshine Law. But in essence, these are laws that say that public records, so any sort of documented evidence that's in the possession of a public body, so a state agency, can be copied and inspected by members of the general public. So really, what you can get through a FOIA request is hard to even there's really no limit. Anything that's been put in writing and is not otherwise considered exempt is a public record. It's something that you have a legal right actually to see and obtain a copy of. It's not just that you have a legal right in most states to obtain a copy of that. Things you cannot get through FOIA requests, if you have like a quick question about how something works, like this is not like a way to get like written answers or verbal answers to questions. You can always just, like Emmett and Sarah were saying earlier, call and ask nicely. I have found that works like 99% of the time. You can't get legal advice, and so if you ask a question about like what someone needs to do to get parole, for instance, they won't really be answering those questions for you. And you also can't get exempt records. So states sort of will publish these laws that say all public records in the state of Illinois can be seen by its citizens, except, and then they list usually 20 to 30 different categories that range from healthcare, sensitive healthcare information to in Illinois there's one about standardized tests that students take. And so if you are looking for more information about your state, I've listed a few places, MUCROC, the National Freedom of Information Association, and the Reporters Committee, that all have state-by-state guides. They will show you where in your state code it is so you can read the law yourself. They have sample letters that you can send in, and they will also have information on how long the agency has to respond and how much, and information, and I know we'll talk about this in a second, about fees and fee waivers. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah and Emmett to discuss crafting your request.
Yeah, so the first thing I always like to tell people at FOIA, because I felt this way when I first started sending FOIA requests, try as hard as you can not to be intimidated by FOIA requests. They are for you. You are the people who the Freedom of Information Act is meant to benefit, and don't let anybody tell you any different. That being said, this is sort of some stuff that I have learned over the process of sending dozens and dozens of FOIA requests about what works and what doesn't. So the most important thing you can do is do your research ahead of time so that you can be clear with the office that you're talking to about what you want. You will get so much further if you know the name of the document you're looking for, because as Matthew said, there's no requirement to answer a question or produce a new record that doesn't already exist in response to a FOIA document. You're much, much better off if you know that something that you're asking for exists. So trying to find those specialized terms that the agency uses to describe their work is going to be a lot more helpful to you. Just as an example, in Illinois, if you call up the MSR people and start talking about parole, there are people who will get pissy about it because they're like, we don't have parole, and it's the whole thing, and it's just stupid. But it's the kind of thing that can grease the wheels a little bit. Ask only for what you need. It's really tempting, and I love data sets so much. So it's really tempting to be like, I would like all of the information dating back to 2010. And yes, that could be very helpful for you. But there is a ability to deny for too burdensome requests, and you will get hit by that so fast, especially if you ask. Especially I find if you ask for things that are more than between 5 and 10 years old. And often there's actually a decently good reason for that, which is that these places change their data systems pretty often. So a lot of times if you can figure out when they last changed their data system, it's when you ask for stuff that's older than their most recent change that they get pissy, because then they have to go look through paper records or whatever. This is wildly important. Ask for the format you want. I have gotten responses to FOIA requests in the truly the most archaic kinds of things. I mean, I've gotten CDs, I've gotten paper, just like stacks of paper. So you want to ask, if you want Excel, ask for Excel. The other term you can use is machine readable, which basically just means like you gotta send me something that my computer can read that's not just like a stack of PDFs. It doesn't always work. Sometimes they still send you a stack of PDFs, but it's at least you're trying. And always include your contact information and offer to discuss the requests. You can get a lot further if you can talk to a human, and that can be really helpful. So costs and fee waivers. FOIA can get expensive under certain circumstances. Most states though, but not all states, but most states, have some fee waiver process, and they allow fees for record copying to be waived if publishing the documents is in the public interest. Every state uses slightly different language. Basically the idea is you don't get to use this if you're using FOIA for like commercial use or for your own purposes, but if you're using it to educate the public more generally, you can get it for free. The problem is it's usually up to the agency itself whether you qualify. That being said, like there are like this is not to like totally dissuade you. I get fee waivers all the time. It's perfectly possible. Just be aware that like it's not a given when you ask for a fee waiver that you're going to get one. The best way to go about it is to include specific details about how you plan to disseminate the records and how that will benefit the public. So this is a statement that I've used. Disclosure of these records will contribute to an upcoming publication that will help the public understand how the parole board works and who is and is not receiving parole, right? And Matthew will get to this in a second, particularly if you end up having to appeal your FOIA request or otherwise have somebody look at it, you've stated really clearly, I deserve a fee waiver. Also, always ask them to contact you with the amount that it's going to cost before they invoice you. That's just good common sense. But sometimes the way I write it is if I know that I'm fine with a certain amount, I'll say like, please contact me before you invoice me if it's going to cost more than $10 or more than $25 or whatever. Because sometimes they'll come back and they'll be like, oh, it's going to be $300. And you're like, I don't really think it's going to cost you $300 to put this together. But okay, let's talk.
So yeah, once you've crafted your FOIA request, you usually can submit them online via email. If you go to the state agency's website, they should have a tab that says like public records, public information, open records, FOIA. Send it to that email, submit it through that portal. The next step is you have to pester them more often than not. Most states, although I've come across a few that do not have a specific timeline, most states have a timeline under which the agency has to respond. So in Illinois, you are owed a response within 5 business days of your request. It doesn't have to be the full production, but you're owed something. So they can extend the time, they can deny, they can produce some and say we're going to produce some later. But in every state it's different. I actually find that Illinois, the 5 days is pretty aggressive compared to some other states. In some states it's much, much, much more. And you should track any extensions. So like in Illinois, they're allowed to extend it for like 5-day chunks. But after that one expires, you should hear something from them. Another extension, a denial, some records. And so be very careful to track your extensions and how long they've taken. Once you get what you're looking for, you should very carefully look over them because once the process is complete, you would have to start all the way at the beginning, which in some states can mean sort of waiting 6 months. And I know in the federal system, it's all like, you have to wait like years even sometimes for records. So once you get your documents, look through them very carefully to make sure they have everything you asked for, to make sure that they didn't redact anything that you need. So that can be one of the toughest ones to find, but just looking for these I had a redacted thing up earlier, looking for just like those suspicious black boxes that are covering up something that might be very useful to you. If you're denied, right, so if you send in your FOIA request and you wait your 5 days and you're super excited and you get the email and it's denial, here are some common reasons. Sarah mentioned the biggest one I get, which is unduly burdensome. That is the favorite of Illinois' parole board. They just claim that for basically everything. There is also these records do not exist, so like we don't track this data. We don't have a policy manual specific to early parole discharge decisions. Specific statutory exemption, so in Illinois, for instance, a state, again, I'm just going to Illinois because I know it best sort of off the top of my head, but in Illinois, the master file of someone in the Department of Corrections system is exempt from FOIA. So if you go to the Department of Corrections and you say, I want this person's file, they're gonna say, no, that's confidential. And the last is sort of a broad category of privacy and confidentiality, so phone numbers, addresses, social security numbers, health records, records under the Federal Privacy Act. These are all records that might also be denied. If you think you were basically screwed and denied records that you had a right to, in most states you have two tracks. You can usually start with an administrative review. So this is where you ask your state's attorney general's office usually. In the federal system, I know you ask inspectors general, like the office of the inspector general of that agency. You ask them to review the denial. So you'll send them your initial request, the agency's denial, and your sort of reasons for why you think the agency's in the wrong. And the attorney general's office will look it over and render a decision that is usually binding on the agency. And so if they agree with you, you get those records. And if they disagree with you, then you don't get those records. The other thing you can do is litigate. So every state I know of has sort of a path into court. This would be in state court unless you're suing under the Federal Freedom of Information Act. Obviously, litigation is costly. It takes a long time, and not really an available remedy for everybody. You can also sort of, the one thing I'll say about this is that if you are someone that either likes to litigate or likes FOIA a lot, you can always sort of craft a request to litigate. And that is to say, you can sort of, if you think like your parole board denies everything for being unduly burdensome, you can always submit a request that you think they should give you, but you know they will deny, and then you can litigate right away if you want to.
Yeah, and just to give a quick plug, PPI has a records request guide on our website. One of the things we have is a full listing of administrative review offices. Not every state has one, but a lot of them do. Sort of who to call. Those people can also be helpful to call just to say, I'm having trouble, can you help me? Because they're usually just the FOIA nerds in the AG's office. And there's like not a ton of FOIA nerds in the world, but if you can find the one for your state, you may find that they can be really helpful. The FOIA nerds in Illinois are pretty great, actually.
I also just wanted to say real quick, I know like a lot of people are going to be looking in their states, but there are some states that have residency requirements for when you're talking about records requests. Missouri, I think it's one, Virginia, Tennessee.
Arkansas.
So there are a few, in our advocacy toolkit, you'll find a guide about that. We have a listing of all the statutes and everything that you can kind of reference that and use that as well.
There are also a couple places that restrict whether incarcerated people themselves can send records requests. Fewer than you'd think, actually, but there are a couple that have specific bars, either total bars on FOIA, those are less common, but sometimes bars on individual kinds of information, like discipline records and things like that.
I'll also quickly say that Muckrock, which is sort of FOIA nerd organization, will pair you with somebody who will file on your behalf in a given state. So like if you don't live in Arkansas, but you really want something in Arkansas, you can sort of go through their system and they will find someone who will submit it on your behalf. The trade-off is that any information you get goes on their portal. Which also reminds me that there are places that have like FOIA repositories. The federal government does this, and I know some Illinois agencies do this. I don't think that the DOC doesn't do it, but they do it for some other agencies. But some places will just post FOIA requests that they get and the response, because they're all public information, so just because they give it to one person doesn't mean person B can't get it. So that could be another place to look. It's similar. If you guys want to...
Yeah, sure. So what do we do with data once we have it? So I'm going to let Matthew will talk about litigation, but I'm just going to talk more generally about using data for advocacy. So there's not a lot on this slide because the uses of data for advocacy are so diverse. I mean, you could be using it to convince legislators of things. You can be using it to convince your fellow activists that something is important. But one of the most useful things that you can do, no matter how or for whom you're using your data, is translation. figuring and basically getting data from a format where nobody's gonna read it and it's impossible to figure out into a format that people can understand for a general audience. So if you get a data set and you're like, well, what am I actually gonna do with this? Thinking of it through that lens can be really, really helpful. A lot of times for like a statistical data set, I think people are sometimes intimidated of like, I don't know statistics, like how am I supposed to, do this? I also don't know statistics, I am a lawyer. I do a ton of data analysis, and the reason I do is because most data analysis that is useful for advocacy is counting. Like that is basically what you're doing, right? You are counting how many people got denied, how many people got set back, and then you are taking those numbers and you are making them into percentages. It sounds silly, but I think I, for one, was really intimidated by like, I'm not a math person, like I don't know if I can do this. It's like 6th grade math, I promise. And then always consider visuals. Visuals are gonna be the best way to communicate information to most people, and that is just becoming more and more true as we all get more online and read less, frankly. So figuring out, at PPI, we love our graphs. If you know our website, you know this. And it really is how we approach data, is looking at this and saying, how can we get this into a format? Because we know that when people read our long articles, what they do is they scroll down to the images. And I think all of us have the experience of doing that, so be aware of that when you're sharing information.
And just one other thing, so when we look at the numbers, we're looking at the quantitative data, we're looking at the scope, right? You pair that with a narrative, you pair that with the qualitative data, right? To actually show what the problem actually is, right? The impact of the problem. This is how widespread it is. But the qualitative data, talking to people and learning like what they actually go through with this stuff that's really, really important to sort of use for advocacy.
Yeah, one of the things that I've always found very helpful is if you have stuff from a survey data and you can say, here is the response I got from the survey data. 57% of people who go through the parole system experience something like this, then you've magnified the power of that one story and helped provide a context. So Matthew.
So to be honest, I mean, if litigating is, trying to just convince like a judge or a jury that you're right. So in many ways, like these are very similar answers. But to sort of use this information to sort of create litigation, there's a couple different ways that you can sort of translate what you got into a complaint. The first is you can look at back-end results. So parole denials, like they were saying, like we have a ton, if you have like a ton of parole denials, if you have a ton of people getting revoked, why is that happening, right? Like what's driving it? The other thing you can do is you can really thoroughly investigate one person's story. Maybe you had an interview with someone and you're like, wow, this person really, was not granted the protections they were supposed to be. You can thoroughly investigate that person's story, and then you can either use that to sue on behalf of that one person, or you can use that as a starting point to say, is this a systemic issue, right? Like, did this one person fall through the cracks of the state's attorney appointment system, or does the state never ever appoint attorneys for people facing parole violations, right? The last thing you can look at, and this is not quite data, but as a starting point, is any legislative changes that may create different avenues or routes to sue. So if your state, for instance, changes supervision lengths and then says, we're gonna make that retroactive, right? So like in Illinois, like if on mandatory supervised release, let's say they cut your term of supervised release from 2 years to 1 year, and they said, we're gonna make that retroactive for everybody. You can start by just saying, did they actually make it retroactive for everybody, right? Like, is there anybody in this big data set who's still serving that longer term? Why is that? The other big thing you can use this for is finding a plaintiff. So if you know there's a problem, or if you know from sort of a previous slide, you've determined that there's a problem, data, interviews, surveys are great ways to find a plaintiff. Using FOIA requests for, like Sarah and I were talking about, like getting non-aggregated data of prisons can be super, super helpful, because you can then say like, here's everybody who we think was eligible for this thing who didn't get it, right? And then right there you have your pool of people to draw from who could be a plaintiff in a lawsuit, who could be your client. More labor-intensive ways, like we talked about earlier, include sending a lot of surveys out to try to find people who are eligible for whatever you're looking at. interviews with people, working with allies in the community who may know somebody, or inside outside organizations. The only thing I'll say, and I'm happy to, we have some materials on this that I can send, but engaging plaintiffs can sort of vary by state. In most situations, if you're representing a legal nonprofit, a lot of your state bar association's rules around like soliciting clients don't apply the same way. If you're representing a for-profit law firm, you have to follow usually pretty strict guidelines around reaching out to people and legal advertising and sort of all that stuff. So that's just a thing to keep in the back of your mind as you're going through this, that you don't want a really great case to get to result in some kind of like bar complaint against you. And I know that people do file bar complaints in these situations. And so the last sort of area in which data can be super helpful, and this is very similar to what Sarah and Emma were talking about, is about like substantiating your claim or trying to sort of demonstrate how widespread a problem is. So these are snippets from a complaint that the National Parole Transformation Project recently filed in Alabama regarding a form of release called mandatory release. It basically said that everybody in prison who's not released onto parole should get out anywhere from like 3 months to 24 months before the end of their sentence. But we found out that they're not really doing that very often. And we were able to use data that we got through a FOIA request to put in pretty stark terms the scope of the over-detention. And so you can see here on the top one, from the date of effect, thousands of people have been held past their date. You can see here that 6 people died while awaiting a mandatory release date. They should have been out, including one person we found who was murdered while on the inside. Lastly, you can sort of see here the true scope of it. There were over 2,000 people who were over-detained, held beyond when they had a legal right to release, which accounted for about 941 years of cumulative over-detention. And so what you can do is you can just kind of lay out in really stark terms, like our individual clients in this complaint have issues, but this goes beyond the 3 people that we represent in the complaint. This goes to basically anyone who walks through an Alabama prison is going to be affected by this, is kind of what we're saying. And then the last thing on here is a couple slides where it just like lists different types of legal claims you can bring. This is pulled from a guide to sort of investigations that our team has put together that we can send around, and I will not be going through all of these individually because I would much rather take your questions. But there's a couple of different claims you can bring, including in the revocation process. People have due process rights. They have a qualified right to an attorney to bring evidence in their favor. So that's a very big one you can litigate. Equal protection claims, ADA claims, right? Like the parole process can't even in processes where you don't have a right to release, you can't be discriminated against, whether on the basis of your race, your gender, your ability or disability. There are some states where you have a right to parole, including this case down here. The last one is the case that we just filed. And then lastly, sort of like there's 2 other big types. Transparency, so like you can bring a FOIA lawsuit against your parole board. You can try to get access to otherwise closed parole hearings. And lastly, there's a lot of litigation around juvenile life without parole, sort of coming on the heels of Miller v. Alabama and it's sort of like child cases. We do not do a lot of life without parole for minors just on my team, so I don't really know a whole lot about it. But I guess one last flag is that a lot of the rules around like finding information about like children going through the system is much more difficult than adults because of the privacy concerns. And so even though this is maybe a bit of a strange note to end on, if you are trying to learn more about how it works for children, it will be more challenging, and a lot of what we have talked about here won't apply. Like they are exempt from FOIA laws and whatnot. So, yeah. With that, I think we'd love to take people's questions, and we invite people to also ask questions both about the presentation, but also if they have any like specific questions about the states that you live in or you work in, or a state you're interested in learning more about. We like encourage folks to ask specific questions, and we can kind of brainstorm together as well. So. I'm just gonna come next here, guys.
I think I saw something. Yeah, right in the front.
Yeah, first I just want to say thank y'all so much. I done learned so much. I took all these pictures, but this was really helpful. I wanted to ask a question about archive records, like records that they may have put away that they claim they can't find. How can you go about getting those archive records?
So it can be hard because of what I mentioned about that unduly burdensome thing. So a lot of times, like when I used to deal with Illinois Department of Corrections, sometimes there was a date before which they were like, everything before that is written on paper. Because it would take so many staff hours to go find that stuff, we can't. There's two big ways around that. One, I think, is to be very specific and say, I'm literally asking you to bring me one file. You can go bring me one file. And the second, which I have not done, but I know people who have done, is sometimes, particularly if you're lucky in terms of where they are, you can go and look at these records yourself if you're looking for one particular thing. So sometimes you can get them to let you inspect the records, even if they won't do it for you. But archive records can be difficult.
And I just had one follow-up question. Where I'm from, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, we had the most juvenile life come home. But what I'm finding with my organization, even like after a certain point, if you didn't get released between 2018 and 2017, they're constantly getting hits, frivolous hits for, they couldn't get in programs because they was lifers and they wouldn't allow them to participate in programs. So now that they're coming up on the board, they're saying that they, are eligible because they didn't complete certain programs. And in some cases, like literally people hadn't had write-ups in over 15 to 12 years and they're still getting, these hits. But, they're filing reconsiderations and things like that. But I was wondering, do y'all have any advice around how to bring up, how can data or surveys or speaking with them can raise awareness on that? Because it's like they're giving them life sentences through the board now. And I know a couple people that passed away, that had a number of parole denial hearings.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely say, like, I think showing what programming was available, like, so there are definitely places that have programmatic requirements when you're talking about parole. New Jersey's one of them. They wrote into their presumptive parole law, like something about, or if, to make sure that a person didn't have access to programs, that it couldn't be held against them. That's a little bit further on from what you're talking about. But I think, like, looking at, what kind of programming was actually available to folks during that time, like, might be helpful. It's just a suggestion, but that would be one thing I would look at.
I think this is also somewhere where storytelling is perhaps the most important thing. It's being able to tell one person, somebody's story start to finish and explain, what happened and the lack of ability of, like, so many people do not understand this lack of availability of programming concept. And I think the ability to tell that story about, like, what is it really like to be behind bars and be told because you're never getting out, you can't do a program, and then to be told, oh, actually you could, but never mind because you didn't do I think that fundamental unfairness has some teeth that could get the larger public interested in things. So I think, finding ways to tell somebody's whole story, and then, even if you can just substantiate it with a couple of data points, even if you can just say, okay, well, here's a little bit that I know about the programming. Here's a little bit that I know about disparities. You can get somewhere.
What about if it's the nature of crime? They say that the nature of crime thing.
Yeah.
No,
So we're looking at the factors that they use, right? Like, so you have places that have guidelines for parole. California has them, other places have them, some places don't. One of the things that I try to look at is dynamic factors versus static factors, right? Like, how many factors are there that people can actually change over time, that people can actually affect, versus the factors like the nature of the offense. You have places where they've implemented, like, these new juvenile parole, people who were juvenile lifers and now they're coming up for review, but some of the assessments that they're looking at are like, have you had a job? Like, what was your job situation, right, before you were incarcerated, your ability to pay bills, like these kinds of things that happened before someone was ever incarcerated when they were 15 to 16 years old, right? And so, yeah, looking at these things and sort of like showing like how these static factors are just fundamentally unfair. that you cannot actually change them. And really encouraging like the focus on the dynamic factors that people have control over, and in terms of policy.
Thank you.
I have a question. When you say like what you were just talking about, like in terms of policy, and then have you done statistics on what it looks like when people actually do get to achieve what's required and they still get denied because of the nature of the crime or the victim?
No, one thing I will say is that I know that there are a number of states where the guidelines, they're just not following them. Even when they are like that, they want to consider like you're supposed to consider these dynamic factors. You look at the adherence rate, and it's like 20%, right? So they're following the recommendations of the parole board at like 20% of the time, or recommendations of the guidelines. So,
but in those 20%, have you seen people? Because like I'm from Texas, so they definitely it's horrible, but I still know people who have gone to college, did everything they could, how they could, and it's the nature of the crime or the victim protest.
One thing that I was able to do in at least one state, which was Alaska of all places, they kept data specifically on the reasons for denial in each case. That was able to let them be able to say to their legislature, hey, they have one that's called, granting parole would depreciate the seriousness of the crime, right? That they're sort of catch-all. And it was something like 75 or 80% of cases were getting denied for that reason. And so that ended up having, I think, some explanatory power for their legislature. What they're trying to do now in that state is get rid of that reason to not grant parole. And it has a lot of explanatory power in terms of being like, well, if you change this, it would affect this many people. I have not looked into whether other states keep that data, but that would be the kind of thing that'd be a very
Do you know a case?
What?
What's the case?
It's not a case there. It's the ACLU of Alaska is putting forward some legislation on it, but I can get you some stuff on it.
I've seen through our work in Mississippi, where we're doing work, we see a lot of people, and these are not public records, but we see them because people who are our clients or who are requesting legal information will send these to us sometimes. They're sort of parole decision sheets. In some states that may very well be like public information. I don't believe it is in Mississippi, but like in Illinois, one's parole file is actually an open record. And so you could always, I don't know what it is in Texas, but you could always see if you could get like a bunch of parole files and see what are the reasons listed there for denial as well.
Well, it is, they have an online where you can look it up and see the reasons for denial, but a 2D is nature of the crime or things that cannot be changed, or substance abuse was a part of the crime,
Yeah.
where they have history of when they were juveniles and now they've been in prison for 20 years and they're still getting denied. But another reason why I ask is because we also have the MRIS, which is like a medical release, y'all spoke on briefly, and there's people who still get denied even though they're terminally ill by the parole board because of the way our system in Texas is. Because even if you're approved through TACOME, which is the medical side, it still goes to a parole board and they can still get denied because of the nature of the crime or the victim protest.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the fact that you have access to that data is actually really cool. And I know that sometimes the way that works is you look at it and you're like, oh, the only way I could do this is to sit down and count like how many people were denied for this reason or this reason or this reason. But sometimes that's valuable to do. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you guys have any experience with getting at federal restricted use data, like for BOP and things like that. I mean, I found the process is pretty crazy in the number of hoops they want you to jump through, like getting IRB approval, even when it's anonymized data. And if you're working in an advocacy context, you don't necessarily have like an academic institution behind you. And I'm just curious if you guys have figured out ways to get through that.
I don't have a ton of federal experience except to know that it sucks. Like, sorry. But what I will say is that there is a fair amount of, like, you go through the Muckrack National Reporters, there are a lot of people who do federal FOIA, and so it can be easier to find people who will help you with that, on that wavelength. In terms of IRB approval, I mean, I have partnered with IRBs before, and, it really is sort of it doesn't feel like something you can do, but you can just call up the IRB at a local college and say, hey, this is my situation, can you help me out? Sometimes it'll work. So I mean, the way PPI has gotten around IRB requirements is that we've met them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, it's a privilege to be here first and foremost. One of the things is for this young lady, Texas residents, we're also out of Texas. And there's a group of us here. I can't say that we can answer your question specifically, but you should definitely get with us during lunch or whatnot, and just so we can kind of collaborate, because we've got a lot of things that's going on in Texas. I've been working in the parole industry for over 10 years, and I've learned quite a bit about our parole system there in the state. And one of the things that we do want to change is this standard denials where everybody in prison gets the same reason no matter what the offense is. According to legislation, there's supposed to be a specific reason for denials, not a cookie cutter reason. So there are some things that we're doing, and it's going to take a lot of legwork. The guys on the inside can't change it, so it's going to take us on the outside to start implementing those changes, which can help family members on the inside. But yeah, certainly talk with us a bit later, okay? You'll see us. We'll be a big group. You'll see us.
What's the organization?
Well, we collaborated. Now, I have a parole news magazine. It's called Parole News Magazine. It goes around the nation, but I have a lot of stories about Texas in there, but it has stories from every state in the union that has a parole.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I just wanted to know that the Policy Institute have any like upcoming webinars or ongoing.
We do. If you go to prisonpolicy.org/trainings, that is our advocacy department's website. We have a couple of webinars that are up there now. We usually do like 2 a year, so there'll be more that are coming up. We don't have a webinar on FOIA, but we do have a really detailed toolkit.
They have a great toolkit.
Just a comment, again, back to the Texas. You know, I'm personally impacted by incarceration, and that was the practice in California for many years, until they started putting it in the court, because that was a reason for denial consistently, no matter what you did, how you did it, when you did it. It was because of the nature of the crime.
Yeah.
So finally, a judge stood up and said, the crime will never change.
Yeah.
And they can't continue to use that as a reason for denying parole. And then when the parole board would use that, then you have an opportunity or avenue to get in court, because now there's a court rule saying you can't use it. And until someone changes that and stand up and say, this can no longer be used. In addition to that, you can't continue, like if I go to the board tomorrow and they say, okay, you're being denied because you didn't get your certificate or whatever. When I go back, they can't use that same reason. So people have to start, or states probably need to start a suggestion to start putting it in the courts until somebody makes that decision to change that.
So for the families, they want to help the inmates, and help them get out. And we tell them write, support letters. What other impact can they give on that so that they can help the inmates and help, the parole boards see, hey, we're their support system here. We're going to help them. Is there anything that we can do?
Yeah, that's pretty tough. Yeah, I mean, different states have different access, right? So like in Alabama, people don't even get to appear. They don't really even get to go before the parole. They make a decision without them there.
Yeah.
And so access it very much differs in different places. Letters of impact, I think, are the primary way that the family is actually engaging in, letters of impact, letters of support, making sure that when people go before the parole board, that the parole board knows that they have support, they have a place to go, they have people who care about them, that they're not out there by themselves. I know, I know there are a few of us here that have been impacted, and we are pretty aware that without eyes on us while we're in there, anything can happen to us, right? And so making sure that it is known that people are watching is vitally.
I would also, there's a couple programs around the country. I know there's one in Massachusetts, and then Anthony Dixon's program, Parole Prep NY, are organizations run by mostly formerly incarcerated or families that are taking this like systematic approach to that question, saying like, okay, we're gonna have a time that we start meeting with people who are up for parole, and we're gonna work with them on their autobiography, and then we're gonna work on support letters and make sure their programming requirements are in place. That's obviously a huge community organizing lift, but I think that those have been really and they work with, and they do this, at least the one in Massachusetts I know does this with volunteers, so that they have volunteers from the community come in and partner one-on-one with individuals to work with that, individuals and their families.
The last thing I'll add is just in the revocation context, because we do a lot of work around revocation, is if there is that family members can be witnesses at a revocation hearing. We've spoken with and worked with family members who have been witnesses at revocation hearings saying, I was I went to the state police and saw my loved one, my son, my daughter, register, right? Like I saw them do it with my own two eyes, like I was there. Or in one instance, I saw them try to register and they were told, oh, like there's a computer error, but we'll get you, it'll happen this afternoon. And so being a witness in those contexts can be very helpful in a parole violation sense. And it can sometimes take a little bit of tenacity to actually get to testify at a parole violation hearing, because they will be closed to the public or done very ad hoc, sometimes even over the phone. But that can be another avenue for loved ones.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Alexis. I'm a law professor at NYU, and happy to see you guys because I stalk your websites and cite all your stuff, read all your reports, so thanks for being here. I just wanted to ask, so, as someone who is sometimes working on, outside of representing people, research projects, you mentioned, some of the residency restrictions on FOIA laws and that kind of thing. And I guess I just wondered, looking at some of your work, it seems like sometimes you have 32 states or 33 states, and I wonder, kind of what your approach is generally to thinking about trying to tell a national story. Are you doing 33 states because you couldn't get the other 17 because of residency restrictions or something else? If I'm asking you to divulge secrets in public, you
No,
can talk privately, but
it's actually a question that's got an interesting answer that I think we're working on internally in terms of how we think about it. So in general, we and Ravina thinks this way too, think about parole as there are states that have it and states that don't, because there are, let me do the math here, 17 states that sometimes since the 1970s have abolished parole, right? And so a lot of times in those conversations, those states get left out entirely, and that's something that Prison Policy Initiative's done. We did a grading report of grading all the parole systems, and we just gave them all F minuses because we were like, well, you don't have one, so I can't grade your parole system that you don't have. I think actually, evident in my work in the past year or so, I'm beginning to feel like there's a lot more nuance to that conversation, especially because of things like revocation, where even in states that don't have parole, there's still a parole board, or there's still an authority that's doing that. So that's the answer to the question is that we have in the past thought about that in sort of a binary way, but I think we're reconsidering that.
can I just add one data point that might be of interest, which is I had a client last year who, in my proudest moment as a lawyer, we got him out after 51 years. He left but he was, because he was in so long, he was convicted in 1972. And he was in New Jersey. And so one of the things that's interesting about that is, because of the wreckage of mass incarceration, how many people are left behind who are still subject to the old regime, even if, they did eliminate parole in 1985 or whatever. And so a lot of states I do think have kind of dual systems where they have, the people who have life sentences who've been there forever. And so I don't know, it's just interesting kind of food for thought.
Yeah, and there are also states that are now adding back little parole categories, in Illinois, there's been, there's been stuff about juvenile or people who were juveniles at the time they were arrested. that's been like, then suddenly like those people are in the bucket, even though Illinois doesn't have parole.
Right.
So, man, the thing about it, if you say parole, the MSR people, they get.
They get so mad.
get-
Well, he's not on parole.
He's on
Like,
parole,
come
we're talking
on.
about parole. It's very annoying, but yeah, anyway. Thanks.
It's definitely, there's no, and I do think that the Rabina people say this as well in their stuff, but there's no like truly like determinate sentencing or indeterminate sentencing state out there.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, we have one more question, I think, probably, yeah.
Okay, well, I just want to say that I want everybody to consider exactly what you said, that there are a lot of states that are trying this quasi system. In Washington State, we have what's called determinate plus sentencing for sex offenses. And it's parole by another name. And so in 1983, we got rid of parole and had determinate sentences. But by 1990, they start this indeterminate sentencing. And it went fully into force in 2001. And people are being revoked left and right for no good reason. A lot of times it has to do with things that are out of people's control. I have an individual in my organization whose mother died, and he wanted permission to leave the state, but because he is under the lifetime supervision scheme in Washington State, he was told that he had to go back to have a treatment provider create a safety plan. Well, he hadn't been in treatment for 15 years. So which treatment provider is going to help him to create this safety plan so that he can get a travel pass to leave the state? So, I think that, it's really good for us to consider the fact that these bad ideas pop up. They just like to call them a different name.
Thank you all so much. We will send out
There's a sign-up sheet that should be going around, but it's over there, I think. If you haven't yet and you would like these slides and information, please put your name and email, and I believe it's lunchtime.
Yay!
Hey, grading parole in all 50 states, that was a fantastic work you guys did. I loved it.
Thanks.
Yeah, and we actually did a little sit down on it
Oh, yeah.
with the graphs.
Yes.